The lesson of the desert. When dawn finally broke, the sandstorm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt more threatening than the howling wind had been. The 6 bikers emerged from their rocky shelter, exhausted and disoriented, to find themselves in a landscape that had been completely transformed. The familiar landmarks they had used for navigation were gone, buried under new sand dunes created by the storm. Their motorcycles, though protected, were partially buried and would require significant effort to dig out and clean before they could be started. More disturbing than the changed landscape was what they discovered around their shelter. In the soft sand, clearly visible in the morning light, were dozens of large paw prints. The tracks formed a complete circle around the rocks where they had spent the night, as if multiple lions had maintained a silent vigil throughout the storm. Deepak knelt down to examine the prints more closely, his hands trembling as he measured their size with his fingers. "These are fresh," he said quietly. "They were made after the storm ended. They were here while we were sleeping." The realization that they had been surrounded by lions during the night, completely unaware and defenseless, sent waves of terror through the group. Yet they were alive and unharmed, which raised disturbing questions about the intentions of their watchers. Suresh, his voice barely above a whisper, pointed to something that made their situation even more surreal. Leading away from the circle of tracks was a single set of prints that were different from the others, smaller, more hesitant, showing the gait of a weakened animal. "Those look like the prints of the lion we found yesterday," he said. "The one we left behind." Raj followed the tracks with his eyes, noting that they led directly toward their current position, and then joined the circle pattern. "It made it here," he said slowly. "Somehow, that dying lion traveled across the desert in a sandstorm and found us." The implications were staggering. A lion they had assumed was near death had not only survived a major sandstorm, but had tracked them across miles of shifting sand. It had somehow reunited with its pride and led them to the exact location where the bikers had taken shelter. Ankit began the difficult task of digging out his motorcycle, but his movements were mechanical, his mind struggling to process what they were discovering. "This doesn't make sense," he kept muttering. "None of this is possible." Mohan, who had always prided himself on being rational and logical, was having a complete mental breakdown. "Lions can't track across sandstorms," he said desperately. "They can't coordinate like this. They can't communicate over long distances." But the evidence around them told a different story. The precision of the tracks, the coordinated positioning, and the fact that they had been watched all night without being attacked suggested intelligence and organization that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Vikram was frantically trying to get his phone working to call for help, but even when he managed to get a weak signal, his calls wouldn't connect. It was as if the desert itself was preventing them from reaching the outside world. As they worked to prepare their motorcycles for travel, they made another discovery that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Leading away from the circle of tracks, heading back toward where they had originally encountered the lion, was a clear path marked by disturbed sand and occasional paw prints. Raj, despite his fear, felt compelled to follow the path. What he found at the end of it defied all logic and reason. In a small depression surrounded by rocks, someone or something had created a crude but effective shelter. Inside the shelter, lying on a bed of gathered desert grass, was the young lion they had encountered the day before. The animal was alive, but clearly still in distress. However, it was no longer alone. Arranged around the shelter were containers made from large leaves and stones, filled with water. Fresh water, in the middle of the desert, far from any known source. As Raj approached cautiously, he noticed that the lion was watching him with alert, intelligent eyes. There was no fear in the animal's gaze, but there was something that looked remarkably like expectation. The other bikers had followed Raj and now stood in stunned silence, looking at a scene that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife, survival, and the natural world. Deepak noticed something carved into the rocks around the shelter, symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language any of them recognized. The marks appeared fresh, as if they had been made recently, but by what or whom was impossible to determine. Suresh, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, approached the shelter slowly. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice breaking. "We left you to die, and somehow you're alive and being cared for." The lion lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, but showed no signs of aggression. If anything, the animal seemed to be studying each of the bikers in turn, as if making some kind of assessment. Ankit noticed that beside one of the water containers was a small pile of what looked like desert berries and roots, food that had been gathered from somewhere and brought to nourish the recovering lion. The implications were mind-boggling. "Someone is taking care of this lion," he said slowly. "Someone who knows how to find water and food in the desert. Someone who can build shelters and create tools." Mohan, his scientific mind struggling to find rational explanations, suggested that they had stumbled upon some kind of research station or wildlife rescue operation. But the complete absence of any human infrastructure or technology made this theory seem unlikely. Vikram began filming again, documenting the shelter and its impossible contents. As he recorded, he noticed movement in the distance, figures watching them from the tops of nearby sand dunes. The figures were too far away to identify clearly, but their posture and movement suggested they were neither fully human nor fully animal. The young lion, apparently sensing that it was safe, began to drink from one of the water containers. Its movements were stronger than they had been the day before, suggesting that whatever care it had received during the storm had been remarkably effective. Raj made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He pulled out his own water bottle, one of their precious supplies, and poured its contents into one of the makeshift containers near the lion. The gesture was small, but it represented a complete reversal of their earlier attitude. "We were wrong," he said simply. "We should have helped when we had the chance." One by one, the other bikers followed his example. Suresh contributed food from their emergency rations. Deepak used his first aid kit to examine the lion's condition, though he admitted he had no idea how to treat a wild animal. Ankit used tools from his motorcycle repair kit to improve the shelter's structure. As they worked, the watchers on the distant dunes began to move closer. The bikers could now see that the figures moved with the fluid grace of large cats, but they walked upright and seemed to use tools and coordinate their actions in ways that suggested advanced intelligence. Mohan, his voice filled with awe and terror, whispered, "What if lions evolved differently here? What if isolation and harsh conditions produced something beyond what we understand as normal wildlife?" The idea seemed impossible, but so did everything else they had experienced. The evidence suggested they had encountered a community of highly intelligent desert-adapted lions that had developed capabilities far beyond those of their conventional cousins. Vikram's camera captured the approaching figures more clearly, revealing creatures that were unmistakably feline, but with modifications that seemed to represent adaptation to both bipedal movement and tool use. They moved with purpose and coordination that suggested complex social organization. As the bikers completed their efforts to help the young lion, the approaching figures stopped at what appeared to be a respectful distance. They watched silently as the humans worked, making no threatening moves, but clearly assessing the change in behavior. The young lion, now visibly stronger and more alert, stood up and walked slowly toward the edge of its shelter. It looked back at the bikers once, and in that moment, something passed between species. An acknowledgement of debt repaid and lesson learned. The watchers began to withdraw, moving back toward the deeper desert with their characteristic silent grace. The young lion followed them, pausing only briefly to look back at the group of humans who had learned to show respect for life in the harsh beauty of the desert. As the figures disappeared into the distance, the bikers found that their GPS had suddenly started working again, and their cell phones were receiving signals. The way back to civilization was now clear and unobstructed. They rode home in silence, each processing an experience that would change their understanding of the natural world forever. The story they eventually told was met with skepticism and disbelief, but they had learned something about the consequences of their actions and the intelligence that exists in forms they had never imagined. The desert had taught them that mockery of the vulnerable carries a price, and that respect for life can transform enemies into protectors. They had been given a second chance, and they would never again underestimate the wisdom of the wilderness or the creatures that call it home. Years later, whenever they passed through desert regions, they would remember the lesson of the lion and the mysterious guardians who had shown them that intelligence, compassion, and justice exist in forms that challenge human understanding of the natural world. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares its wisdom with those humble enough to learn from their mistakes.